Morning everyone, I am Kiro Massotti and I'm going to present a paper written by Timothy Beasley and Robin Hughes, two professors from London School of Economics, titled Land Reform, Poverty Reduction and Growth, Evidence from India. This was published on Quarterly Journal of Economics in 2000, and so this was one of the first paper published in the new millennium. As the title suggests, the authors want to link the land reform in India with a poverty reduction strategy and a growth process. In 2000, in the first year of the new millennium, was approved the Millennium Development Goals, and the more interested institution of poverty reduction was the World Bank. That in that year suggests to the country mainly policy to enhance growth, because it was a general belief to enhance growth in order to reduce poverty. The main economic theory about this was a trickle down. The theory explained that once a country reached a higher growth rate, the distribution to the various stratification of the population is done automatically. The growth process increases wages for the richest and also for the poorest. The paper go on a different way because it connects a land reform as viewed as a redistributive policy and the poverty reduction. And the main contribution of this paper is to test econometrically, because this relationship between redistribution and growth was produced a large literature, but there were no real data about India, I mean microdata. And why are the authors interested in India? Mainly because of two reasons. India is a home of a significant fraction of poor people in developing countries, and on the other side, under Indian constitution, the various states were granted the power to legislate and approved a land reform, and after the post-independence period, it was subject to a massive body of legislation approved. So India is an interesting case study because of the high incidence of poverty and the large volume of land reform. And the land reform is viewed as a distributive policy, and also as a policy to change the contract terms of the land holdings and tenants. In India, there were mainly four kinds of land reform. Tenancy reform, that allows the tenants to hold the ownership of the land, abolish intermediaries. Intermediaries worked under the lords and they have to collect rents, so abolish them allows more surplus for tenants and landless. Land ceilings is a sort of redistributive policy towards tenancy, and land consolidation is quite particular because it's not really a redistributive policy, but on the contrary is a policy that want to achieve a higher output for agriculture. As I said before, the link is between land reform and poverty reduction, and the poverty data are based on a consumption distribution collected by Dutt and Rabanian, and the relatively long time data allows econometric estimates. And the empirical model is a simple panel data regression in a fixed effect version. As you can see here, the independent variable x is a poverty measure in a state S and time t, as a function of an unobserved component in a state S plus a yearly dummy in a ELT. Y is a set of exogenous variable for, as usual, state S and time t, plus a land reform that is treated as a variable. In this model, land reform takes a very particular form because it is a lagged version of the variable. Why lagged version? Because the authors, and as you can understand by yourself, once a reform is approved, it takes time to explicate effect on the poverty measure, so it should take time. And so estimating this panel data model, we have a table of results, and aggregating the 4 kinds of reforms, we have this first variable here, regressed versus the rural poverty gap. And I don't know. And in parentheses, you have the Z statistics that in the first column of estimate is greater than its own critical value. So the relative coefficient is negative and statistically significant. So the land reform is associated with a reduction in rural poverty gap. I just stress rural because it's a land reform. But the authors want to know which of the 4 categories of land reform drives this aggregate movement. And as you can see here from the estimate, the only statistically significant variables are abolition of intermediaries and tenancy reform. And this is also true for rural headcount. Is another measure for poverty. Because of the kind of reform, we shouldn't expect that urban poverty gap should decrease because it's a land reform. And instead, our intuition is confirmed by the data. Instead, the coefficient is not statistically significant. So we have a land reform that affects the rural poverty gap, but it doesn't affect the urban poverty gap. So we should expect that this difference should decrease. And instead, the poverty gap difference is this difference, and the land reform explicates quite well this reduction in the differences. Just to sum up, tenancy reform and abolition of intermediaries are driving the aggregates effect of reducing poverty. The urban poverty doesn't respond to land reform, and the aggregate cumulative land is associated with a reduction in rural-urban poverty difference. Now, let's think if we were a policymaker, and you know that a land reform is associated with a reduction in rural poverty. What you should do? Probably, if you see an area where the poverty is higher, you are probably tempted to implement more land reform. So, this sort of thinking leads to a sort of endogeneity, and econometrically this leads to a bias. And to fix this problem, the authors implement an instrumental variable where, as a first stage equation, we include a political variable in order to isolate this sort of endogeneity. And the first stage is built mainly as before. We have the same component here and a large version of the land reform, and Z is the set or controller, and Z is the share of seats in the parliament or a congress in the various states in India. As you may guess, the left parties probably are more care more about a rural area. Probably right side of politics are more attentive to richest one. And the authors estimate the same things controlling for this political variable, and as you can see, the results are mainly the same. The lagged aggregate land reform is associated with a reduction in rural poverty gap, and the coefficient is statistically significant. And again here, the main drivers are tenancy reform and abolition of intermediaries. And this is true for rural poverty gap and also rural headcount. The same for poverty gap differences. At this point, you should know that, or you can guess that, if you have a laborer in the agricultural side, you can suspect that the wages in agricultural area are increased because laborers in rural area can offer only a labor supply. They don't earn nothing by capital investment. So using Indian Ministry of Agricultural data, they replied the analysis as before, and as before we have the sets of covariates and real agricultural wages, and the increase land reform is associated with the increase of real agricultural wages, and the coefficient is statistically significant. But in this case, the only the main driver of this increase is the abolition of intermediaries, because as I said before, this allows more surplus to tenants and landless people. So our principal finding is that land reform reduces poverty, but land reform, as I said before, is a redistributive policy, and it helps poor people. But there is a large literature that evidences this trade-off between redistributive policy and growth process. More is the redistribution, less should be the growth rate achieved by a country. So now we make this simple question. Could this policy reduce the economic performance of this country? And following more or less the same regression framework as I shown before, adding this autoregressive component, the authors estimate again the same set of variables. And as you can see, the main taking the log of state income per capita, we can understand that the main explicatory variable, the main explicatory variable of this process is the state income per capita of the previous year, the autoregressive part, and the other land disaggregated variables are not really explicative of this process. And but if we look only of log of agricultural state income, the things changes, because the autoregressive part is again statistically significant, but the tenancy reforms have a negative coefficient, but statistically significantly, and land consolidation legislation, as I said before, it wasn't a redistributive policy, have a positive and statistically significant impact on the process. And the same is also true for agricultural yield. So, in ways of a conclusion, we can therefore evidence a link between poverty reduction, tenancy reform, and abolition of intermediaries. The other variables are more or less negligible. A reduction of the all India poverty gap of 1% can be explained by land reform. Because of the wages, agricultural wages increases, this reform helps a lot the landless. And the last part I think it's really significant because in some sense implementing this kind of reform helps to gain time, because implementing this the land reform has similar effect on poverty reduction to 10% increases in per capita income, or around 4 or 5 years growth at the all India average growth rate of this period. And this is explicable of the fact that poor people need immediate policy. Thank you.
Okay.
Can I ask?
Yeah.
What is inside the tenants reform that and what is the link?
Yes, in the tenancy, okay, in agricultural economy, there are 3 parts. The land holdings of the lord that don't work is only the owner of the land. The tenant that manage the land agriculture and works, and the landless who work and make effort. The tenant is a sort of principal, and the landless is a sort of agent. The tenancy reform gives the ownership of the land to the tenant. That in this model is a sort of principal. As you may guess, they can internalize the profit of the work, isn't it? Okay. In the other schemes, the owner remain. Okay, are you
Right.
interesting?
Yeah.
Okay. In the other scheme, the owner remain the landlords. Okay.
Okay.